Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. In this video, we'll first introduce the literary genre Song lyric, 宋词, and then look at the life and work of China's most famous woman poet, Li Qingzhao, who's best known for her writings in the lyric form. To review, we have introduced that there are several major poetic genres in the Chinese tradition. An earlier form of poetry is fu or rhapsody, which was popular during the Han Dynasty period. Poetic writings by women during the Han period, such as Ban Zhao and her grand-aunt concubine Ban, are in the form of fu. Sima Xiang Yu, who we have learned about in the story about Zhuo Wenjun, is the best-known fu writer in Chinese literary history. Next, the Shi poetic genre, which is characterized by lines of equal length. The Shi form started to emerge during the Eastern Han period and matured during the Tang Dynasty. Usually there could be 4, 5, or 7 characters in each line of a Shi poem. Among the women writers we have introduced, Xie Daoyun from the Jun Dynasty, Shangguan Wan from the early Tang Dynasty, and the Tang courtesans Xue Tao and Yu Xuanji all wrote in the Shi form. Yet, Shi is a definitively masculine genre. Its famous early practitioners include members of the Seven Sages, such as Ji Kang. Later, poets of the Tang Dynasty, such as Li Bai, Du Fu, and many more, created the most classic corpus of the Shi poetry. The Tang poets' contribution to the Shi genre was paradigmatic, and the form Shi came to be permanently associated with the name of the dynasty, that is, as Tang Shi. In particular, Tang poets created 2 classic styles of Shi, quatrains, or more literally, broken lines, 绝句, and the regulated verse, 律诗. Simply put, Tang poems are built on the principle of parallel couplets. A quatrain has 4 lines or 2 couplets. A regulated verse has 8 lines or 4 couplets. Tang poems typically have 5 or 7 characters per line. For the question of gender, we need to know that Tang poems have a distinctive masculine style, in the sense that they typically feature historical and philosophical themes, and the default poetic persona in these writings is a scholar or a hermit. As an exception, music bureau, 乐府, or palace style, 宫体 poems, which we have introduced earlier, were often written in the voice of a woman, that is, a lovesick or abandoned woman. However, these poems were meant for entertainment and performance, and were typically held in lower regard as literary pieces. Then what is 词 or lyric? As a literary form, 词 refers to poems with lines of unequal length, written according to popular tunes. This genre flourished during the Song Dynasty. Writing a 词 was called filling the lyric, 填词, since the length of each line is determined by a certain melody. And the lyric is usually named after its tune title or 词牌. Popular tune titles include One Cut-out Plum, 一剪梅, The Butterfly Loves Flowers, 蝶恋花, 念奴's Charms, 念奴娇, and so forth. This is why you may encounter hundreds of different lyrics with the same title, The Butterfly Loves Flowers, 蝶恋花, since they're written according to the same melody. As you can probably tell from this strong association with popular songs, 词 poetry emerged as a continuation of the style of music bureau or palace-style poems, and they were initially performed by female entertainers or courtesans in parties like the one in the painting here. We can even find from the Song period porcelain pillows inscribed with lyrics, and these objects probably belonged to courtesans. Yet 词 gradually obtained a greater literary value starting from the ending years of the Five Dynasties. One of its most famous early masters was the last emperor of the Southern Tang Dynasty, Li Yu, who was taken as a prisoner by the founder of the Song Dynasty, Zhao Mingcheng, and possibly died by being poisoned by the order of Zhao Mingcheng. Li Yu wrote several famous Ci poems expressing his sorrowful state as a prisoner, thus starting a tradition of using the Ci form to express authentic autobiographical experiences. During the Song Dynasty, Ci poetry became a serious literary genre and was written by many men of status. Similar to the close association between the Shi poem and the Tang Dynasty, Ci poetry came to be attached to the name of the Song Dynasty as Songci. However, in comparison to Tang Shi, Songci is more genderly ambiguous since it emerged from a tradition of representing female sentimentality. Although Ci came to represent the voice of men of feelings, as we see in the case of Li Yu, its most typical persona continued to be that of a lovesick woman. For an example, let's turn to a famous lyric attributed to Ouyang Xiu, a famous scholar and historian of the Northern Song Dynasty, who've been holding high court positions for decades. Let's keep his background in mind and see how much contrast it forms to the lyric we're going to read. The tune of this lyric is "The Butterfly Loves Flowers," 蝶恋花. Sometimes it's attributed to Feng Yansi rather than Ouyang Xiu. But since Feng Yansi was also a senior male scholar official, this question of authorship does not affect the contrast we're seeing between the persona, a lovesick woman, and its actual author. The lyric begins with a scene deep within the courtyard, a feminine space completely separated from the outside world. As the lyric goes, "Deep, so deep within the yard, how deep I cannot say. Piles of mist among willows, veil behind veil, beyond number. 庭院深深深几许，杨柳堆烟，帘幕无重数." The repetition of the word deep, 深, in the Chinese original emphasizes the thoroughly secluded nature of the woman's dwelling. The misty willow and the numerous curtains in her surroundings are all images that block her vision into the outside world. Yet, in her mind, she can visualize her husband's presence in the pleasure quarters, as the lyric describes. His jade-studded bridle and well-wrought saddle are there where he takes his pleasures. From the upper chamber she cannot see the Zhang Terrace Road. 玉勒雕鞍有野处，楼高不见章台路. And ironically, as we might imagine, this type of party scene was precisely where this lyric might have been performed. The second stanza of the lyric begins with the following lines. "The rain is violent, wind blows wild, it's the end of May. The gate stands shut in twilight, no clever plan to make spring stay. 雨横风狂三月暮，门掩黄昏，无计留春住." These lines portray the end of spring and the fading flowers. As we have introduced before, these are stereotypical metaphors for an abandoned woman who has passed the prime of her youth and beauty. And here are the ending lines of this short lyric. "With tears in eyes, they ask the flowers, but the flowers have nothing to say. A tumult of red flies away past the swing. 泪眼问花花不语，乱红飞过秋千去." The swing was the only sport available to a woman living deep within the courtyard. By riding on the swing, a woman might also catch a glimpse of the outside world beyond the misty willows. The ending lines further evoke the image of the fallen petals, a tumult of red, which symbolizes both the woman's desire and her desperation. Now, if a senior male scholar official can portray female feelings with such poignant sentimentality, what could a real woman writer do with the Ci genre? On the one hand, this could be a new literary opportunity, since given its conventional feminine quality, a woman's writing had a better chance at being culturally accepted as authentic and emotionally moving. On the other hand, this could be a new limitation as well, given the female stereotypes already set up by men for women to express their feelings. With these questions in mind, let's move to the case of the famous Ci poet Li Qingzhao, who also happened to be China's most famous woman poet. We'll look at how she tackled the literary problem of Ci, as well as her own experience as a woman, by tracing her relationship to her husband Zhao Mingcheng and her lesser-known, traumatic second marriage. Li Qingzhao was born in 1084 and died in 1155. Around midlife, she experienced the fall of the Northern Song in 1126 and 1127. We'll look at the impact of this momentous event on her personal life. Li Qingzhao was born in a scholar official family. Her mother also came from a scholar official family and was highly educated. So here again, we see a woman writer with a very privileged social background. When she was 18, Li Qingzhao was married to a scholar official named Zhao Mingcheng. By all signs, this was a happy marriage, especially given the common intellectual interest the couple shared. Specifically reflecting the rising scholarly interest in antique collection during the Song period, Li Qingzhao and her husband were ardent collectors of ancient paintings, books, and calligraphy. Likely, the large collection of objects they gathered over the years could well supply a modern museum. The couple also collected a large number of rubbings of inscriptions on ancient stelaes, similar to the example shown here, and they wrote detailed descriptions about them. Tragically, much of their collections was later lost during the war. In her late years, Li Qingzhao compiled the remaining copies of ancient rubbings by her husband into a book entitled Inscriptions on Bronze and Stone, 金石录. The book includes about 2,000 inscriptions, but perhaps represents less than 1/10 of the couple's previous collection. Li Qingzhao also wrote a postface to this compilation and offered there a moving narrative about her life with her late husband. The postface is very long, and you can read the full translation in red brush. Here we'll just highlight a few passages indicating the couple's common intellectual passion and their companionate relationship. The first passage is about the couple's shared sorrow when they couldn't pay for the high price asked for an old painting. I remember that once during the years of the reign period exalted peace, someone brought us a painting of peonies by Xu Xi, for which he asked 200,000 copper coins. But in those days, even the scions of noble houses would have found it difficult to come up with 200,000 copper coins. So we kept the painting for 2 nights, but in the end had to return it, as we had no way to come up with that amount of money. For several days, the two of us, husband and wife, were filled with regret and disappointment. The second passage is about the memory game the couple often played after dinner, and Li Qingzhao portrayed those moments as the happiest of her life. Now, I happen to have a good memory, and each time, when we would sit in the hall of returning home after dinner, we would point to the pile of books and histories and say which event was found in which book, in which chapter, on which page, and in which column of the text. The person who made no mistakes would win and was allowed to drink his or her tea first. Whenever I hit the mark, I would raise my cup and laugh out loud, at times even spilling my tea on my clothes, and would stand up without even having had the opportunity to drink a drop. I would have been happy to be allowed to grow old in this realm. Li Qingzhao proudly portrayed herself to be her husband's intellectual superior, but the focus here is on the couple's intimacy and companionship on an intellectual, spiritual level. Rarely can we find in women's writings from traditional China descriptions of such an equal, heartfelt partnership with her husband. And as we might assume, given their great relationship, Li Qingzhao must have penned a number of love poems for her husband. That's likely the case, although we often cannot pin down the exact circumstances of her Ci writings. Moreover, we have discussed earlier on the issue of escaping the conventional female voice in Ci writings. That is, how to escape the stereotype of a lovesick woman when writing about your own feelings. On this point, the authors of Red Brush offer an insightful analysis. Li Qingzhao shows a much greater individuality even when she treats the same themes. Moreover, she uses a great variety of melodies, shows a more creative use of language, and on occasion inserts what appear to be personal details. This latter characteristic of her work invites critics to read not only some, but all of her lyrics as direct expressions of her personal and deeply felt emotions. Keeping this comment in mind, let's read one of her most famous lyric pieces. Likely it was written when she was relatively young, and when she and her husband, Zhao Mingcheng, were forced to separate from one another due to a political fraction at the court. This lyric is written to the tune of One Cut-out Plum, 一剪梅, and begins with the setting of early autumn. The red lotus has lost its fragrance. The jade mat feels autumnal. Slightly loosen my gauze skirt. Alone I board the orchid boat. 红藕香残玉簟秋，轻解罗上，独上兰舟。 The lyric then portrays other images of autumn suggestive of her longings. Who will send me from the clouds a letter of brocade? As the formations of geese return, the moon fills the western tower. 云中谁寄锦书来？雁自回时，月满西楼。 Early on, we have seen the image of migrating wild geese, 鸿雁, as an image expressing one's longing for home or a loved one. Moonlight, on the other hand, is another major symbol of longing and connection in Chinese poetry, since it shines on everyone, no matter how far apart. Presenting these affective images, Li Qingzhao also elegantly employs simple yet evocative verbs such as hui, to return, and man, to feel, to express the state of her emotion. Then the lyric moves into its second stanza. Blossoms tossed and scattered, the river flowing on, one and the same the longing, in two places the idle sorrow. This feeling, I simply don't know how to make it go away. Barely has it descended from my brows, then it descends again into my heart. 花自飘零水自流，一种相思两处闲愁。此情无计可消除，才下眉头，却上心头。 Although fallen flowers is such a conventional trope, Li Qingzhao's rendering of the image is refreshing and touching, perhaps in part because she situates herself on an equal position as her husband, and underscores the reciprocity of their longings. That is, they shared the one and the same longing, 一种相思. The ending lines ingeniously and convincingly express the incessant nature of her longing, again with simple and effective verbs, to descend and ascend, or 上 and 下, to express that the longing is always in her heart, even when she's not showing it outside. Li Qingzhao left behind around 80 poems and essays such as the postface to her husband's inscription collection. Likely, the full beauty of her poetic writings can only be appreciated in the Chinese original. But even through translation, I hope that you can sense her ingenious literary mind and her approach to express personal and authentic feelings, even through apparently conventional images. Now, let's go back to her postface to her husband's inscription collection and read some passages related to her experiences after the death of her husband. Zhao Mingcheng died in 1129, the third year after the fall of the Northern Song. As Li Qingzhao narrates in detail in the essay, her husband fell ill when embarking on a journey for his official duties. She traveled to her husband's side and witnessed his last breath. Then, the Jin army invaded and she had to flee as a refugee, while guarding the several carts of collections she and her husband had accumulated. As we can imagine, there was no way for her to keep this valuable collection intact under the given circumstances. In the postface, she portrays the dispersal of this collection, representing her past with poignant details, as in this episode on how her collections were stolen away despite her vigilance. I now had only about 5 or 7 baskets of calligraphy pieces and paintings, inkstones, and inksticks. I could no longer bear to store them elsewhere, and so I kept them always under my own bed, and I always unlocked and locked the bedroom myself. While in Guiji, I lodged with a local family surnamed Zhong, but one night someone made a hole in the wall and carried off 5 baskets. I was inconsolable and offered a large reward for their recovery. 2 days later, a neighbor, Zhong Fu Hao, appeared with 18 scrolls demanding the reward. In this way, I knew that the thieves had been local people. Despite all my efforts to recover my possessions, the other things were never returned. I now know that they were all purchased for a low price by Transportation Commissioner Wu Yue. So now, of all that survived, 70 or 80% had disappeared. At the end, Li Qingzhao sorrowfully recalls her husband's collation of the inscriptions. Clearly, the disintegration of the couple's once impressive collection is emblematic of the disintegration of her own life. But yet I love and cherish the few scattered and incomplete books and quite ordinary pieces of calligraphy in my possession as I do my life. What foolishness, is it not? When today I happened to read through this book, it was as if I saw the departed one before me, and I thought back how his lordship, in the hall of tranquil governance in Donglai, when the scrolls had first been mounted, provided them with a title strip and binding string, and wrapped every 10 scrolls together in a single cover. Each day, after the end of the evening watch, he would collate 2 scrolls and write a postface to one. Of the 2,000 scrolls in this collection, 520 have such a postface. Now the work of his hands is still fresh, but the trees on his grave have already grown tall. How sad. Characterized by documentary-like details and a deeply personal tone, Li Qingzhao's postface is one of the most memorable autobiographical writings in traditional Chinese literature. especially as one written from the perspective of a wife. However, in this piece, she left out a traumatic episode she went through. That is, her second marriage to a low-ranking official named Zhang Ruzhou when she was 49, 3 years after Zhao Mingcheng's death. This second marriage turned out to be a total disaster, and she filed for divorce within 100 days. For that, due to a wife's subordinate position to her husband in the ritual system, she landed in jail for 9 days. She might have been incarcerated longer if not for the help of a distant relative who was a government official. A letter she wrote to the official to express her gratitude is now extant. There she made it clear that she was deceived by Zhang Ruzhou, her second husband's glib talk before marriage, whereas his true interest was in her money. After their marriage, when he found that she's not as wealthy as she had expected, Zhang began to physically abuse her and even threatened to kill her. In her own words in the letter, "While I myself had earned public contempt for my disgusting behavior, he was determined not only to carry off the prize, but also to kill me. And so he gave free rein to his brutal violence, and each day I suffered his beatings." As a victim of domestic violence in a deeply unequal gender system, wherein a woman's file for divorce was criminalized, Li Qingzhao ended her letter by blaming herself for having made a terrible judgment. "It was not heaven's punishment that I was forced to live with this cruel and violent man for 100 days. It was not the doing of someone else that I had to spend 9 days in prison. I have only myself to blame for this stupid mistake, and it was my lot that I should come to know the inside of a jail." We don't know much about Li Qingzhao's later years after this traumatic second marriage. It seems that she used to seek a position in the inner palace as a tutor, but her request was not granted. We wonder if it had something to do with the damage to her reputation because of her second marriage. Among Li Qingzhao's famous 词 writings, one piece called Reduplications extended 声声慢 has been widely said to reflect her sorrows during her late years. However, some scholars have recently made the discovery that it was likely written during an earlier period of her life when Zhao Mingcheng was still alive. According to this new theory, she wrote the piece when Zhao Mingcheng attempted at taking a concubine. If this second theory is true, even her happy marriage with Zhao Mingcheng was not perfect. Now let's read this lyric itself. Whether it was written before or after Zhao Mingcheng's death, its depiction of autumn forms a sharp contrast to images in the more romantic lyrics she wrote in her younger years. Seeking, seeking, searching, searching, chilly, chilly, cheerless, cheerless, dreary, dreary, dismal, dismal, wretched, wretched. The weather suddenly warm, then cold again, makes it hard to regain strength. 寻寻觅觅，冷冷清清，凄凄惨惨戚戚。乍暖还寒时候，最难将息。The duplicating sounds in the opening lines, 寻寻觅觅，冷冷清清，凄凄惨惨戚戚, have been celebrated for its haunting musicality. Then the lyric says, "How could 2 or 3 cups of weak wine be a match against the gusting winds as darkness falls? Migrating geese fly by. What pains me now? Once long ago, they were my friends." 三杯两盏淡酒，怎敌他晚来风急？雁过也，正伤心，却是旧时相识。 The image of the migrating geese, as those she knew from the past, is a sad refrain of her past line, 雁自回时, as the formation of geese return. Next, the poet portrays herself as damaged chrysanthemum flowers. Chrysanthemums cover the ground in heaps, wilted, withered, damaged. But who today takes pleasure in them and will pick them? Sitting by the window, all by myself, how could I bear to see it turn dark? 满地黄花堆积，憔悴损，如今有谁堪摘？守着窗儿，独自怎生得贺？ Chrysanthemums are the flower of autumn in Chinese poetry. They have been praised for blooming while the weather turned cold, and treasured as a symbol of longevity and moral integrity. Yet here, even these flowers that symbolize endurance are damaged. Finally, this sad lyric ends with these lines. The wutong tree, and then that drizzling rain, that into dusk. Drip drops, drip drops. How can all of this be disposed of by the one word sorrow? 梧桐更兼细雨，到黄昏，点点滴滴。这次第，怎一个愁字了得？ The leaf of the wutong tree is another prominent symbol of autumn in Chinese poetry. Supposedly these broad leaves are the first to fall when autumn comes. The last line of the poem again exemplifies Li Qingzhao's literary ingenuity. Sorrow or chou has been the conventional theme of song lyrics, yet now she states that the sadness within her authentic experience is beyond what the literary form she now resorts to and what language itself can express. Moreover, we should note that the Chinese character for sorrow or chou consists of the character autumn, 秋, above the character heart, 心. Autumn is the season when everything starts to fade, and is thus strongly associated with the feelings of sadness in the Chinese tradition. Li Qingzhao thus ends a lyric filled with sorrowful images of autumn, with all the evocative meanings within the character chou itself, while asserting that the sadness she is experiencing is even deeper. We have mentioned that it's debatable whether this lyric was written before or after Zhao Mingcheng's death. For a lyric that can be more reliably traced to her late years, after Zhao's death and her traumatic second marriage, we can look at the next lyric dating to the year 1135, when Li Qingzhao was 53. The breeze has dispelled the dust, all the fragrant blossoms are gone. The days have passed, but I'm too lazy to comb my hair. The setting is the same, but life has changed. So much has come to an end. Before I can speak, the tears flow down. I've been told that spring on Copplebrook is still fine. I too would like to boat there in a scull. But I'm afraid that such a tiny boat on Copplebrook wouldn't be able to move under the weight of all my sorrows. 风往尘香花已尽，日晚倦梳头。物是人非事事休，欲语泪先流。闻说双溪春尚好，野拟泛轻舟。只恐双溪乍猛舟，载不动许多愁。This lyric speaks the sad vicissitudes of life within the permanent cycle of nature. That is, 物是人非. The setting is the same, but life has changed. In the ending line, she imagines that her sorrows are almost physical. They have weight, and for that, she can no longer roam free on the spring river. Having introduced Li Qingzhao's life and the literary writings related to her experiences, let's understand her further as a literary critic. Li Qingzhao was not only a poet, but also a theorist of Ci poetry as a literary genre. In that regard, she has made arguments to criticize the works of male Ci poets, including well-known scholar officials of the period. Furthermore, some male poets during the Northern Song period, especially the famous scholar Su Shi, had experimented with turning the Ci form into a more masculine mode. This movement created the bold and extravagant or 豪放 style of Ci poetry, as opposed to its delicate and sensitive 婉约 style related to the feminine voice. Li Qingzhao was very against this trend. As summarized by the authors of Red Brush, Li Qingzhao protested strongly against this tendency of masculine Ci poetry, which she felt would reduce the lyric to a genre that differed from Shi solely in terms of form. She argued that the lyric constituted a separate genre because of both its subject matter and its formal requirements, and criticized some of the leading poets of her age for departing from the genre's conventions. Li Qingzhao's conservative insistence on the feminine characteristics of the genre, however, should perhaps be interpreted as an attempt to protect the lyric from being subverted by the male-dominated Shi genre and to ensure that women had a genre of their own. Along this line of thought, let's look at Li Qingzhao's criticism of the Ci writing of some of the most famed scholar officials of the time. As for Yan Shu, Ouyang Xiu, and Su Shi, their learning encompassed both heaven and man. So when they composed a short song lyric, it was just as if they had poured out a ladleful of water from their great ocean. Their lyrics, however, are all nothing more than Shi poems, but with lines of unequal length. The prose of Wang Anshi and Zeng Gong reads like that of the Western Han, so whenever they wrote short song lyrics, everyone would fall over laughing because they were impossible to read out loud. From this, we know that the lyric is a genre unto itself, and that there are few who really understand it. Even though Li Qingzhao was not in the position of an absolute literary judge as Shangguan Wan-er, she was certainly making claims on her superior gifts and judgment in the special area of Ci writing, and in that regard, she indeed turned out to be extremely successful, as she came to be remembered as China's best Ci writer, as well as the tradition's most famous woman poet. Meanwhile, despite Li Qingzhao's insistence on the feminine quality of Ci, she left behind some highly masculine literary pieces as well. A famous example is this Shi poem. In life one should be a hero amongst men, then in death a stalwart amongst ghosts. To this day, everyone remembers Xiang Yu, who refused to cross the south of the Yanzi. 生当作人杰，死亦为鬼雄。至今思项羽，不肯过江东。Xiang Yu was a warlord who once competed for supremacy after the fall of the Qin dynasty. Eventually, he lost to Liu Bang, the founder of the Han dynasty. After his defeat, Xiang Yu refused to cross the Yanzi River and returned to his base in the south, lamenting that he could not bear to face his fellow townsmen again, since so many soldiers who followed him had died. Xiang Yu thus committed suicide by slitting his throat by the Yanzi River. In this poem, by evoking the image of Xiang Yu, Li Qingzhao is implicitly criticizing the Southern Song court for escaping to the south without any intention to retrieve the lost northern territories. A few of Li Qingzhao's writings are also impressively masculine. We can read one example here as the conclusion of this presentation. Cloudy waves to the horizon merge with the morning mist, the river of stars about to turn, 1,000 sails dancing. It is as if, in a dream, my soul had returned to God's adobe. I heard the words of heaven, which kindly inquired where it was I intended to go. 天接云涛连晓雾，星河欲转千帆舞。仿佛梦魂归地所，闻天语，殷勤问我归何处。After this grand mystical opening, the poet thus imagines her reply to the inquiring deity. And I replied, The way was long, alas, the evening draws nigh. I practiced poetry, but startling newness of my lines was all in vain. 我报路长皆日暮，学诗漫有惊人句。In this line, Li Qingzhao alludes to the Tang poet Dufu's famous line, 语不惊人死不休. I would not rest in peace if my lines were not startlingly new. Here, by asserting that she has produced lines that are startlingly new, yet to no effect, Li Qingzhao was likely commenting on the cultural limits placed on her as a woman writer. No matter how great her literary talents are, she cannot use it for social mobility or even for making a living, since all social and economic opportunities were closed to her due to her gender. Then the lyric ends with the following lines. A wind of over 90,000 miles that lifts the giant eagle. Please let that wind cease not, but blow my little boat straight to the isles of the immortals. 9万里风蓬正举，风休住，蓬舟吹去三山去。 The giant eagle or Peng in these lines refer to a fable in the Taoist classic Zhuangzi about a mystical bird with wings across thousands of miles. Imagining herself as the giant eagle, Li Qingzhao wishes to transcend this world and join the domain of immortals, wherein gender, along with her other worldly troubles, could be shed away from the essence of her person. On this note, let's conclude this lecture on China's most famous woman poet, Li Qingzhao. This is the last video of the week, so please complete the quiz and move on to pre-class reflections.